I'll introduce the last speaker on our panel this evening or morning, depending on where you are. This is Matthew Switzer, and his presentation is called "The Cosmos Against the Colony: Eco-Civilization as the Antithesis of Gnostic Society." And a little bit about him. Matthew is a PhD student in the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program at CIIS. He has an MA in Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness from CIIS, and a BA in World Literature and Cultural Studies from the University of California at Santa Cruz. A former teacher and occasional dream consultant, his research interests include environmental peace building, dream research, and esoteric studies. He grew up in San Francisco and currently lives in Half Moon Bay. So welcome, Matthew, and turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone. Thank you, Jonathan, Dashish, fellow panelists, and everybody who's staying up late to watch this. I don't have a slideshow, so I'll just share some thoughts with you here. Title of my presentation, as Jonathan mentioned, was "The Cosmos Against the Colony," which I'm going to introduce by drawing on big history and integral ecology, green anarchy, and integral philosophy, following a quick origin story. And in general, this was a response to language in the CFP regarding technophobia and this anti-civilization, primitive, nomadic romanticism opposing progress. So this was a fun opportunity for me to sort of share some thoughts on anti-civilization, anarchy, and cosmogenesis, which I try never to pass up. So with implications for sustaining the contemplative community. So we'll see how this lands. So part one, anamnesis. Robert McDermott suggests in a transcript I don't think survived the CIIS website change that CIIS's Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program emerges at the confluence of two currents, the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at CIIS, as well as the field of ecology and religion more generally, both largely influenced by Thomas Berry and Brian Swimme. Robert suggests Thomas Berry was to the French Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin what Haridas Chaudhri was to Sri Aurobindo, the foremost scholar on the elder's work. Later, in his remarks on the occasion of Rick Tarnas and Brian Swimme's recent retirement from PCC, he mentions Brian's lecture series, Powers of the Universe, as the outcome of a collaborative co-teaching of cosmological history and anthroposophy, which Brian later describes as an inquiry into the metaphysic beyond the materialist scientific positivism characterizing modern science, and drawing from anthroposophy, theosophy, Kabbalah, Hermeticism, depth psychology, and various other esoteric and indigenous traditions for a vision of the harmonization of cosmological powers into its human form. So this synthesis of esoteric metaphysics with modern cosmology, I suggest, offers an integral approach to ecology, better able to assist the anti-colonial legacy of integral yoga. In this framework, the cosmogenetic principles and powers underlying psycho-cosmic evolution are present in nature, thought, action, emotion, and will, unfurling in conscious self-awareness to deepen and amplify these universal impulses, complete with emergent symbols and aspirational phrases like eco-civilization and sustainable community. Now, whenever I hear these phrases, I'm reminded of my time studying utopian literature as an undergraduate at UC Santa Cruz, also started in 1968, where a key theme would be this constant oscillation between the good place, EU-topia, and no place, O-utopia, where the mechanisms needed to maintain any such good place typically require an authoritarian and coercive method to maintain that good place, which characterizes dystopia, without which the society in question would fall apart and not exist in any place. So the removal of either E or O from utopia occupies both of these places, good and non-existent, simultaneously. So since 1968, the various developments in radical philosophy have recognized such coercive power structures and systems extend beyond state, capital, race, sex, gender, global divides, to technology, industrialism, division of labor, speciesism, domestication, language, even symbolic thought. Ecocentric radicals, for instance, argue civilization in general, quote, originates in conquest abroad and repression at home. And civilization is at its core colonial, and cities and settlements colonized through military endeavor. Sean Parsons writes of ecocentric anarchism, quote, from an anti-civilization perspective, an urban anarchism that requires the importation of resources from outside will inevitably be maintaining a hierarchical and colonial relationship in which certain groups and people are seeing their land base destroyed for production, by production for technological and economic advantage for the resource and luxury needs of those in urban spaces. Taking Jared Diamond's thesis of agriculture as, quote, the worst mistake in the history of the human race a step further, environmental philosopher Derek Jensen suggests civilization has never been and can never be sustainable, requiring widespread violence without which civilization would necessarily collapse. The intensification and extensification of agriculture in early periods is interpreted here as the long-term collapse of soil fertility, with civilization's accruing power through maximal extraction to import resources to ever-growing city populations, overshooting the land base and eventually succumbing to the collapse set in motion by these exploitative, non-reciprocal, human-driven needs imposed onto the landscape. Sociologist Johan Galtung describes this type of structural violence as an avoidable impairment where institutions cause harm by depriving people of fundamental needs. It is, in a sense, the difference between the possibility of fulfilling needs and the reality of unsatisfied need, the difference being the infrastructural inequality underlying social and economic life. In this sense, political work either maintains or addresses this structural inequity. In the case of the colony, the urban center appropriates resources from ever further lands, typically resulting in what Andrea Smith calls heteropatriarchy and the pillars of white supremacy, slavery, capitalism, genocide, colonialism, and Orientalism and war. Tuck and Yang suggest nothing short of land back to indigenous people, offer anything more than settler moves to innocence, so that social justice is incommensurate with decolonization, where it maintains the colony, constraining the free flow of energy and concentrating it in ever more powerful centers. So, how then does energy want to flow? Part 2, energy flow. Adrian Bajan suggests the structure of the universe is a reiteration of fractal branching patterns self-similar across scale because that is the most efficient way energy flows through mass over time. And so branching structures emerge as energy flow naturally takes this form. Big history, says Bajan, is this constructal law, writ large, displaying the thermodynamic flow structure in its microcosmic forms. Blood vessels, branches and trees, lungs, brains, how the galaxies are patterned. 20 years after his initial finding, the only addition to this description he adds is the necessity of freedom, without which energy cannot move where it would otherwise naturally go. Cosmologist Eric Chasen describes the process where energy flows into ever more complex forms as free energy rate density, echoing Ervin Laszlo's free energy flux density, so that the universe moves from its fundamental particles and forces into creative pockets of energy density to generate the conditions for new complex forms, planets, organisms, brains, and communities of brains to emerge in complex collective learning communities, all the way up to the high-tech global industrial civilization driving mass species extinction, climate destabilization, war, and inequality we see today. The big historian Fred Speer debates Chasen's progressive ascent of evolution, sharing how Chasen fails to account for the infrastructure discounted in the free energy rate density formula used. Brains require bodies, while civilization requires roads, ships, concrete, extractive machinery, and neither of these are included in the formula. Had these infrastructures been taken into account, Speer suggests, it would point out that Aboriginal and hunter-gatherers actually achieved a higher energy rate density than modern information society, especially where large-scale burnings change landscapes in productive ways to sustain these small-scale communities, a statement Speer considers absurd. Obviously, the sheer magnitude of modern industrial society dwarfs the simple living styles of traditional communities in terms of degrees of complexity. So Speer's attribution of modern society as more complex, yet with a lower energy rate density, suggests a trend Joseph Tainter identifies in his study of the collapse of complex societies. Unlike traditional communities able to sustain themselves, civilizations often develop orders of complexities that become inefficient with diminishing returns, much in line with Marx's prediction of capital requiring greater exploitation of land and labor to maintain profit and growth, with recent models suggesting this degradation of environment and inequality and exploitation are independently found to lead to the total collapse of society. This trend of civilization seemingly contradicts the through line of cosmic evolution, whose fractal branching systems underlie biodiversity and ecosystems, as they leverage sublinear and superlinear dynamics so that economies of scale can reap higher energy returns on energy invested, rather than undermine the conditions for their own survival. The science of collapse, collapsiology, and sustainable systems thus suggests a fourfold pathway out of unsustainability into sustainability. One, increase and sustain total energy flow, not likely in a fossil fuel dependent society, peak oil and the unraveling of the climate. Two, reduce the overall mass of the system or structure, including this often invisibilized infrastructures those systems depend on. Three, ensure equitable distribution of energy flow through mass over time, for instance, through mutual aid, otherwise risk partial and cascading collapse. And four, compress the time it takes for energy to flow through mass as equitably as possible, so all parts of the system can get what they need in a timely fashion. These four variables, energy, mass, equity, and time compression, suggest the direction as well as form these energy pathways freely take, pathways radical ecological thinkers suggest are antithetical to the 5 C's of civilization, colonization, capitalism, corporatism, and commodification, re-articulating the corporate state nexus as the genocide ecocide nexus it is. Part 3, Gnostic Society. Robert Bellah, in his Religion and Human Evolution, suggests the axial religious traditions in Greece, India, China, and the Hebraic prophets occurred during a time where urbanizing civilizations are dependent on structural violence and rigid hierarchy, form the context out of which spiritual and philosophical reformers and experimental communities emerged. In doing so, the mammalian impulse for play prompted in the human a theoretical revisioning of social orders more aligned with the divine order of nature that could come into awareness and form the basis of a breakaway community dedicated to cultivating experiential knowledge of the divine. Gnostic communities are, in a sense, engaged in the subversive undermining of the rigid hierarchies and spiritual foundations of civilization and empire. Thus, the utopian kernel underlying axial religious traditions moved across the Silk Roads of Afro-Eurasia to fuse into the syncretic movements and communities that constitute the history of modern esoteric spiritualities, inspiring ancient and modern Gnostic communities alike, where a reappraisal of divine nature implies alternative social forms and utopian experimentation for better or worse. Yet the contribution of post-68 radical theory, as I've already described, suggests any such dystopian elements are less a bug needing to be fixed, but rather a feature of the form in question. If civilization is the history of colonialism, the coercive mechanisms that structure and constrain our highest aspirational goals similarly may reproduce this history wherever we seek to sustain civilization. A Gnostic community seeking to realize eco-civilization, then, may be creating the dystopian conditions they emerged from in the first place. In her 1995 book, In Service of the Wild, Restoring and Re-inhabiting Damaged Land, bioregionalist Stephanie Mills explores Aurobindo in her chapter Green Work in Utopia, pointing out, by way of its members' own assessments, the colonial aspects of Aurobindo, for instance, and again, this is nearly 30 years out of date, as an international hub for affluent, mostly Europeans, using unsustainable energy-intensive building materials, cement, steel, etc., the imposition of new invasive vegetation to make a location habitable, state-subsidized electricity, hired manual labor, the pressure on the land to produce saleable commodities, the dependence on few amateur volunteers to do the green work, the emptying knowledge base of information about medicinal plants as older inhabitants passed on, the impoverished local Tamil, etc. As Mills states, quote, the biggest challenge facing restoration activity in Aurobindo or anywhere is to get it to make sense in a civilization whose relationship to land today is almost entirely exploitative, with parks and preserves being the exception in a pattern of land use for profit rather than basic subsistence. Authentic land healing is not considered economic, and so civilization and restoration are antithetical to one another, offering the context in which an impossible vision prompts ongoing experimentation within the laboratory of evolution. So I've tried in this presentation to briefly sketch out an argument that civilization is fundamentally colonial, and as such undermines sustainable initiatives, including those preventing degradation and inequality. Put otherwise, utopian aspirations aligned with cosmogenetic principles are domesticated, hierarchized, and dominated by techno-industrial colonization, so that the appropriation of symbols are repurposed for the very ends they were originally meant to oppose. We're thus captured in a system of unfreedom that calls itself freedom, gaslit into believing our instinctual opposition to these constraints that colonize consciousness is an uncivilized, maladaptive deformation of nature, whose pinnacle is reimagined as the greenwashed colony in the form of eco-civilization. The questions left over from such a critique are threefold. One, can industrialism ever be ecologically sustainable? Two, is there a way to have industrialism without domination? And three, if industrialism is not sustainable, how to transition to a sustainable form through a radical shift in social organization? The first two questions are answered negatively for reasons already indicated by the post-68 green anarchist critique, while the question of transition to sustainable form can be answered by drawing on cosmogenetic principles aligned with this esoteric metaphysic of energy flow, free energy rate density, and the constructal law applied from the critical perspective of ecocentric spiritual anarchy. Sustainability depends on equity, with both bound up in how energy flow naturally structures itself if given the freedom to do so. The stratigraphy of the soul, psyche, and land hover, like any utopia, then, between what Brian and Barry term in the universe story as the existential tension between the dystopian technozoic and the utopian ecozoic. It is within this tension that new structures emerge, branches extend, and cosmogenetic principles unfurl into self-consciousness, empowering psychic and cosmological integration around the central crisis of civilization, namely its inherent coloniality and unsustainability. These cosmogenetic dynamics pattern the cosmological and psychological structures of and through which we become self-conscious and aware of nature's otherwise unconscious tendencies, and indeed the intact wild world within and around us suggests the necessary infrastructure for Gnostic being to become inscribed in land. My conclusion. To close, Eric Chasen suggests nature's free energy rate density is greatest in sleep, where the need to run, eat, move, and exert energy is less so than in waking state. Classical analytical psychology also centers on the dream as a place from which the archetype in its fractal form emerges to facilitate self-organization towards greater functionality and self-consciousness through reconciling forms and structures. Like other threshold moments in cosmic evolution, then, we might even anticipate a new threshold, one perhaps already achieved by those dreaming cultures self-organizing around visions prior to their destruction, by a mode of colonial social organization that has lost contact with the wisdom of dreams in the increasingly 24/7 electrified plantation that has destroyed much of the wild, self-willed world. How then does an increasingly dreamless, soulless, alienated world deprived by the colony of its deepest dreams differ from the world dreamed by a wild earth? I hope to explore this in my presentation at the Gebser conference in a few days, but for now I'll point to Aurobindo's Integral Yoga, where we can understand the manifestation of nature's deepest tendencies to bring this divine and cosmic energy into our present and its future dimension as divine nature moves beyond and back to itself through us. If, as Sri Aurobindo suggests in the future evolution of man, that, quote, the Gnostic life will reconcile freedom and order, that there will be an entire accord between the free expression of the individual and his obedience to the inherent law of the supreme and universal truth of things, then perhaps the discord between Gnosis and the civilization that constrains it are dissolved where love for nature's deepest cosmogenetic principle can move us beyond the colony's civilized ideal, dependent as it is on extracting value unconsciously, and reformulate our structures according to an experiential knowledge and the deepest dreams of spiritual freedom, rather than the impossible ideals that perpetuate coloniality by other means, despite and by way of our highest aspirations to the contrary. Thank you. And I know I probably went very, very fast, and visuals are always nice, but anyway, thank you so much for listening, and happy to take any questions, or if anybody wants to ask other panelists questions too.
Yes, thanks, Matt. Right now, we don't have any questions from the attendees. I encourage people to send me a question. Until then, I'll open it up to the panelists.
Yeah, Devashish.
Yeah, I think your presentation is very provocative, as well as extremely eloquently phrased. It's argued intensely, and I feel that it requires kind of much lower engagement than what is possible in the scope of this discussion over here. But yeah, I think it's argued very well, and that's what I wanted to say. And also that the way in which you end, I think, needs to be brought into deeper engagement with the other things that you say. I think there is a certain kind of a dichotomy that, so I mean, you quote many people, and it feels as if that there's an argument that is sort of clad in stone, but there are there are things in that argument that sort of I'd say mesh with your ending, and it's a more ambiguous situation where we are talking about civilization and the sort of the overcoming of the egoic drive through spiritual evolution, so to say. That creates its own autopoetic civilizations, I think between the two, there is, of course, what Sri Aurobindo is talking about is to some extent a turnover in terms of our sense of self, a very sense of who we are, what makes us, and that's what the integral is. The integral, in that sense, is the knowledge of the one in the many, and the fact that we can access it, that we haven't accessed it, that we haven't accessed it is due to the fact that we've taken ourselves to be what's been given to us. But you brought in the whole issue of the Gnostic communities of the axial age, of the esoteric, groups, and you've pointed to a danger there in replicating the conditions from which these groups have emerged. And I take it, I mean, it's well taken, because a lot of these groups because of that remained outsider groups. They didn't try to replicate social conditions of any kind, except for being on the periphery, being minor cultures, so to say. So what happens if they try to build a civilization of some kind, even a collective of some kind that has a life other than just the esoteric life of contemplation, so to say? That is really, I mean, so your characterization, for example, of Aurobindo, which you got, I don't remember the name of the author. I felt it sort of lacked those dimensions. I can't see it. You can put it in the chat. That would be, yeah. So it lacked that dimension. It is true on its face value, and there is some truth to it. But it sort of ignores that other dimension that you bring in at the end, which is also going on at the same time. So that was my comment. But overall, I really enjoyed your talk. I think it was given very eloquently and extremely, sort of well argued. So thanks.
Thanks, Adishish. And the author, I certainly pulled out the sort of negatives that she focused on, and certainly, even in the title, this sort of contradiction is front and center. The universe is good, the colony is bad. We're the universe living in the colony, and unless we become conscious of this tension that arises, we risk perpetuating a death system and calling it, Gnostic, because we can no longer tell them apart. And so that is, I think, an important discussion to have, especially as decolonization is, made into a metaphor these days. And
agreed. The other side of it, though, which is what's happening right now, is the use of arguments of that kind by nationalist governments to cut out these communities. See, yeah. So I mean, this is what we are experiencing. I'm just back from Aurobindo with a whole group, and I don't know how much you know of what's going on there right now, but it's a very different kind of spin in which some of this is being used to undermine the very existence and turn it into exactly what you're talking about, a kind of a memorial structure of some kind, where civilization has appropriated the spiritual drive and turned it into some kind of a theme park. So yeah, it is a complex sort of thing, in which has to be looked at in its nuance, I think, from both directions.
Yeah, and the right wing appropriation of even the arguments that I was drawing attention to, the post 68 green anarchist thought. There's a lot of eco-fascist terrorism going on that sort of appropriates that language without sort of deepening into the complex nuances that are necessary to find a pathway. And I also wanted to sort of, is it Peter in the red?
Patrick.
Patrick, thank you. As you were talking about the flowers and this darkness, it really, I thought, resonated with this question of the infrastructural constraints of what it takes to keep a society or community going within this larger context of extractive capital and nationalism, and so there's a really dark contradiction, I think, that I'm hoping can spur, an accelerated evolution to the, a more colorful place. But it's a delicate balance, and it can go off the rails very quick.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matt. I look forward to reading this paper when it comes out, to be able to connect to it on my own time a little bit. You've said a lot of different things. Just one thing that came up as Devashish and you were talking for me was that these contemplative communities of the past, many of them have been places where people were fleeing from exoteric traditions. There's persecution, literally. I mean, so many examples of it. In some religions and at some points in time, there were better tolerance, if you will, of this. But this sort of hiding away, and also being devoted to personal transformation, or if that was ever the case, personal salvation, which is usually the case. It's like, let's get out of society, let's huddle together, let's support each other and see who can eject first, that kind of attitude. The communities that I think are of interest to us in this context should be very different, I think. There should be an acceptance of them from the mainstream society in a way that hasn't happened before, and I don't know how that's going to happen, but even Aurobindo is getting attacked in that same sense, by these external forces. So, and that's why I think these communities have to thrive in a newer context of larger societies supporting them in a new way, by having the members of the larger society becoming more contemplative themselves, so they can relate to these communities. But I don't think that there's any model right now that's truly acceptable. I hear from some of your critiques that there's so many problems, and there may not be any answers right now, and I think that's okay, but we need that solution, and we have to move forward in that direction, I think, regardless of all the issues that exist right now. Just a comment. I don't know if you have anything to say, but
Thank you. Yeah, no, my purpose in writing this was to lay down a gauntlet for anybody promoting eco-civilization, quite frankly, where it tends to be an ideal. It tends to invisibilize a lot of the mechanisms that are the opposite of the ideal. And it requires grappling with those questions in a community that's dedicated to exploring together the meaning of that. And I love your kind of point about fleeing to find refuge, and there is a shortage of places where people can find refuge, and that has gone from the beginning. I think Christianity, if you look at some of these founding documents, or at least the legends, there is a union of the sort of Pauline faction with the Peter faction, and they're both attack Simon Magus, the first Gnostic, in order to unite themselves against in a community of faith against this heretic. and in some cases, this heretic becomes this uniting, has this uniting role that in fact becomes a through line for Christianity that is only kind of brought up later. So anyway, I appreciate what you all have done. I myself am a new scholar to Aurobindo, and can't argue with him, but what I can do is attempt to bring in some of the critical theories that I've heard, since '68, that hopefully other Aurobindian scholars can integrate and work through as we move towards a brighter future, so to speak, that integrates darkness as well.